Gosh.
Does it make it less awkward?
No.
Kelsey and Marissa, welcome to the Gravity Commons podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
We're delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's really great to have you both. We're talking about this book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, today, and I wonder if we could start maybe our conversation by hearing a bit of your story and why this topic is important to you. So, and then also, as you share your story, maybe how your two stories intersected and you decided to write this book together.
Yeah, that sounds good. So, I have been thinking about this idea for a couple of years. A number of things contributed to it. One was some work I was doing researching a novel in the stay at home daughter movement, corner of Christian dominionism. And it had me thinking about the ways distorted theology enables abuse of all kinds in families and in church family systems. And around the same time, my own denomination was kind of embroiled in an alleged failure to respond well to abuse, and different survivor stories were coming out. And I was noting some parallel dynamics again, the way theologies can enable abuse and Christian communities can enable abuse. And while that was rumbling around in my imagination, I'm married to a priest and have been in parish ministry for a couple of decades, and was hearing from parishioners about estrangement and inauthentic connection in their families and extended families, and saw some similarities in the ways adult children were expressing injury. Parents were, both in the church family system and in families, were unable to hear this, unable to listen, unable to tolerate difference, and were families were stuck in fragility, defensiveness. Parents were naming confusion over why their adult children maybe were going low contact or no contact. Adult children were expressing grief that they couldn't experience authentic connection with their parents, that they felt that they had to hide pieces of themselves, or that they couldn't talk about things they had different opinions on. And so a number of those things kind of came together. And a friend on Twitter tweeted out, if there was one thing you could write about if you had all the time in the world, what would it be? And I think I said something along the lines of a book like The Great Sex Rescue for Christian parenting teaching. And the response was pretty immediate. It resonated with a lot of people, both who were reflecting back on their own experiences and who were actively parenting and saying, we want a different way forward. And around that time, I got a DM in my Twitter inbox.
That was me. Yeah, so we did not know each other before writing this book. Marissa lives in the Seattle area. I live in Iowa. And I had kind of similarly started thinking about these ideas years prior, when my first, who's now 8, was around 1. And some people start reading parenting books like before they have kids. I did not even really think of reaching for parenting resources until I had a toddler who could talk to me. And okay, I would like to be kind of responding to things like tantrums and, different challenges in a healthy way. And so I reached for resources that had either been given to me by other Christian parents, friends, and I found myself very, very confused by the gulf between like the old guard Christian parenting resources that I remembered and were in my home, and I knew that my parents and my parents' friends were using. There's this huge gulf between what was in those resources and what you would find in like mainstream parenting podcasts, books by child psychologists like Tina Payne Bryson or Dan Siegel. And I did not know how to reconcile those things. It made me really uncomfortable because I found myself having this very evangelical impulse, like, oh my goodness, what if I do this wrong? What if I give sin a pass and put my child's mortal soul in danger? And then encountering these other resources that gave me language for developmentally appropriate behavior, a much more grace-filled view of the difficulty of being a child. And I was just torn. And so my husband and I were both academics. I was finishing my PhD at the time. He was also in grad school. And we just started keeping notes, keeping running documents, keeping these books with tons of notes in the margins, not really sure that we'd ever do it. Neither of us are in child development or child psychology. It's not our field.
Mhm.
And just sort of for our own, I don't know, consideration. And just kept those for a while. We kind of as a family decided to leave the Christian parenting resources behind. We didn't find them helpful. We just could not make peace with what they were telling us to do, like recommending spanking, for example, which we can talk about. And so we moved on from there. And then, years later, I'm writing for Christianity Today on Christian culture and worship practices, and still not writing on this particular topic. But I saw Marissa's tweet and I just thought, gosh, I'm not the person to write about this. This isn't my field, but I wonder if kind of the research that we've done over the years and the writing I've done over the years could be of help. So I reached out and said, hey, this is something I've been thinking about for a while. If you end up pursuing this, let me know if you want a conversation partner, or here are the books that we've looked at. Here's some of my notes. And we ended up talking on Zoom, and we kind of looked at each other and our different expertise, her kind of having theological training and me being trained as a historian. And we thought, you know what, maybe actually we are the people to write this book. Let's give it a shot and see what happens.
Well, I'm glad you did, because we needed a book like this. We do. You talk about what you call the Christian parenting empire, who is comprised of it, and how it came to be in part one of your book. And that phrase, I think, catches my attention, lots of readers' attentions. I'm curious if you could tell our listeners, what do you mean by the Christian parenting empire?
We start our history of Christian parenting empires in 1970 with James Dobson, who has pretty straightforwardly the biggest Christian parenting resource empire through Focus on the Family. He, with his first book, Dare to Discipline, in 1970, proved that there was a demand and an audience for these parenting books directed toward a white, conservative, evangelical, or even sort of ecumenically Christian audience. He proved that there was a massive demand for that, and a demand for resources that were kind of answering these fears of conservative parents in the US at the time. And he managed to really build an empire, right? So he writes Dare to Discipline. He continues writing books. He starts this organization. He does these video series, radio shows, and he is the first, but not the only one. There are others who kind of follow that model and write a parenting book and do video series, produce curriculum, go on the speaking circuit, and you end up with this cohort of Christian parenting experts. I use that term with scare quotes. And they kind of build these brands of their own, often with no credentials whatsoever. Marissa, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, many of them were very skilled communicators and marketers. They effectively built brands. You have Growing Kids God's Way, Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo are ones who crop up in the late 80s, early 90s. You have people like Ted Tripp, Shepherding a Child's Heart in the 90s, Vision Forum, Doug Wilson's Canon Press, a number of individuals who, yes, were often self-platformed and self-credentialed, made claims of spiritual authority that positioned themselves to kind of speak on behalf of God. And that was very compelling messaging for devout audiences. Typically, they pulled on levers of either fear mongering, kind of saying, if you don't get this right, all of these horrible things will happen to your children, or aspirational longings of, if you do get this right, you can expect this kind of godly legacy, or to change the culture, or arrows in the hand of a warrior, a number of different things that were very attractive to people, particularly parents who were maybe overwhelmed, who were new converts, who were returning to the church once they welcomed children. And into that, you sort of have, once someone successfully sells a book, they became a household name. Gary Ezzo is on the early copies of a number of these resources. He's the prime endorser at the heyday of his ministry, even though when you really dig down, all his credential is that he sold a book that was very successful. And many of them relied on networks. John MacArthur platformed Gary Ezzo. So there were kind of these interconnected webs that allowed them to gain credibility in the community, through which it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors. They expanded ministries globally, and Growing Kids God's Way at one point they claimed to have been used in 70,000 churches worldwide, where weekly people were gathering in churches to review the curricula. So some of these are on par with like what Bill Gothard was doing, in that their whole communities were buying into this, and that really reinforced the credibility as well. So when we think of those empires, wow, they just became really outsized. And then we still have elements of that today. It just takes a different version through social media and influencer content.
Interesting.
Mhm.
What I know there's a lot of voices that are all kind of interrelated and endorsing each other in this whole thing, and you go into some detail in the second part of the book. But I wonder what patterns or common themes you found in your research that these experts, I'm putting that in scare quotes, but these authors, this empire was suggesting. What were the themes?
Mm. I think one theme that I think still is a hallmark of Christian parenting resources is the ultimacy of parental authority. That was kind of James Dobson's message from the beginning. In Dare to Discipline, it was very much the kids these days aren't being disciplined enough, but it was also parents are letting their kids walk all over them. And these kids they have no respect for authority. If only parents would assert and protect their authority in the home, not only would we have better ordered households, we'd have a better ordered society. And so parental authority ends up being held up as this first principle quite explicitly as the thing that all other good things in the household will flow from. And even people who you might not expect, like Chuck Swindoll, megachurch pastor from California, who had a radio show, was very influential in the 80s and 90s. He writes in The Strong Family about the absolute necessity for parents to protect their authority at all costs, like at the cost of relationship even. Like you have to choose this principle over the person when you're faced with a child who will not comply. The way you protect your family and your household, and really in a lot of ways you're standing with God, is by protecting that parental authority. So that's the one that stands out to me as like a through line that still is quite important. When you have a conservative parenting voice that comes up in the Christian circles now, that's still a theme that you will hear articulated in different ways, but it still comes through.
Yeah, and it's really held up and bolstered by this idea that there is a God-ordained hierarchy or order for the home. You maybe have seen the umbrella of authority, the nesting umbrellas. The idea being, there's this order for society that's God, maybe a pastor underneath that, then a husband, then a wife, then the children, and that everyone needs to kind of fall in line for things to work well. And when that doesn't happen, some would say people are vulnerable to satanic attack or certainly to sorrow and suffering. And if they can get those things in line, they maybe will experience God's blessing. And so, or not even maybe, often that's guaranteed. Ted Tripp uses the language of stay within the circle of blessing. That's the idea. And with that comes expectations for obedience. Parents were often told, you, in your position of authority, are an agent of God. You speak on behalf of God. You operate in a godlike role. And the expectation then was for instant cheerful compliance. That's often a running theme, to expect first-time obedience with cheerfulness. And of course, along with that comes corporal punishment as a norm to secure that compliance. So those are also threads that show up a lot that are pretty interconnected with underlying theological beliefs about obedience, punishment, compliance, and blessing. So those are some of the recurring themes. We could talk about a number of them in a bunch of different ways, but it's kind of the bird's eye overview.
This is a side note, but I always thought that umbrella illustration was kind of funny because almost all of the umbrellas are superfluous.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
The big one over the top, doesn't that keep the rain off? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you need a second smaller umbrella?
Yes. Yes. Makes no sense.
Well, I want to get into a little bit about. I'm aware of listeners listening who perhaps were raised with some of these parenting tactics, or listeners who parented their children, And most parents choose, I mean, I'm a parent and I have all kinds of anxiety of like, I don't know what I'm doing. Am I doing it
Mhm.
right? I want to be faithful. And so somebody who's very certain, who is clear about the dangers if I don't listen to them,
Yes.
and gives me all the promises that I want for my child,
Mhm.
that is so attractive to me,
Mhm.
you know, like, so I guess I just want to share, like, there's a lot of, as we're critiquing this, I just want to acknowledge that listeners may have a really complicated relationship with what we're talking about.
Mhm.
And there's room for you here, I guess, is what I want to
Mhm.
say.
Yeah.
Um, Marissa, I'm curious. I know
Mm.
that you talk a little bit about the theology behind um, some of these myths.
Mhm.
And we're going to get in later in the conversation about debunking these, not only from a theological perspective, but also from like a research data perspective.
Mhm.
Um, I wonder, Marissa, if you could take one of those aspects. So we talked about instant obedience, corporal
Mhm.
punishment, strict hierarchical authority. If you could take one of those and just maybe begin to tease out for us, like, what are some of the theological problems?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say the theological fruit, maybe we'll start there. The
Mm,
theological fruit of this, we heard as we wrote, we surveyed a number of adult children reflecting back and older parents reflecting back. And for a number of them, the fruit of this kind of teaching was a faith formation that primarily perceived God as a distant, angry, displeased, or exacting authority figure who was kind of waiting for them to mess up. And how this then played out was if they experienced sorrow or suffering or difficulty, they found themselves asking, what did I do?
yeah.
Like, how did I step outside the circle of blessing? And so I would say these ideas often came with direct catechesis. You know, Ted Tripp says when you're spanking your child, according to this liturgy he offers, you need to say, Daddy doesn't want to do this, but God wants me to do this. So it often was very directly
Mm.
enforced that there's something specific God wants. He's most interested in your behavior, and he kind of doesn't care who gets punished as long as someone gets punished, because these ideas came wrapped up with penal substitutionary atonement, which
Yeah.
historically speaking is a relatively recent view on the atonement. But for many evangelical Christians, it's often the only one they are presented with, and often a very kind of rudimentary version of that. As we were writing and talking about this online, I've lost count of how many people I heard who said, this is the first time I've heard there's any other view of atonement.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
they'd never even been introduced to that idea. So I think that is presented with such spiritual authority in these resources where experts directly claim to be speaking for God. They will often say, you know, I don't say this on my own authority. This is the authority of the word of God. And that brings a kind of, particularly for devout people who value the scriptures, that brings a kind of uncontestable authority to this, where it becomes very hard to critically examine it, because you are then on kind of a slippery slope. Are you doubting the authority of scripture? Are you rejecting the word of God? And I think anytime anybody's speaking on behalf of God, it should put up some red flags for us, but that's so normative in the evangelical subculture, particularly of the 80s and 90s, when you have the inerrancy movement and you have things like biblical or nouthetic counseling that are saying the Bible's your user guide, your instruction manual. So biblical interpretation is a big piece of that. But I would say at the heart of it, this idea of God as harsh and cruel and concerned with sin management and behavior overall, because it became a pressure cooker for everyone. Yes, there was expectations for first-time obedience on children who really bore the brunt of this. But the expectation was on parents as well to obey these ideas and to get it right. Because if you got it wrong, the consequences were disastrous. And often the idea would be there were eternal stakes to this. If you didn't
Yeah.
get instant obedience right with your child, they might not learn how to obey God. And so, yeah, it just was, when we say it betrayed entire families, we have that in mind.
Yeah. Christy, as Marissa's talking, I'm thinking about our formation groups that we lead.
Yeah.
And they're really just Christian parenting recovery groups.
Yes.
Mm,
Something that's so foreign to
Mm.
what you're talking about, Kelsey and Marissa, is like, why do we need love?
Mm.
Like, what does love matter?
yeah.
Um, love, gets kind of sequestered into this very tight, narrow box of obedience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Instead of, well, in your book, you describe that some of these same people are on the attack these days against things like empathy
Mhm.
and boundaries. And I know your
Mhm.
book really isn't. We're going to talk. Maybe I'll ask you at the end, like, where do we go for like good guidance? But
Mhm.
I wonder, Kelsey, like if you could just chat a little bit about, or Marissa, about why empathy and boundaries are so threatening to this
Mhm.
empire, and why would we consider them good?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think empathy is a huge threat here. And part of that it has to do with the way these books are marketed to parents. In They're sort of this answer to you, Christian parent, your impulse is going to be to let your child walk all over you, right? This goes back to the authority thing. Your impulse is going to be permissive
Mhm.
every time. You are going to like want to give your child the benefit of the doubt. You are going to want to over connect, over empathize. Don't trust that part of yourself that wants to do that. You need to come down decisively on sin every time and not like give your child the upper hand. So there's this adversarial relationship framed from the beginning between parent and child, even starting like the Ezos start with this in infancy. Like,
Mhm.
don't
Yeah.
empathize with your child crying. They're manipulating you, right? Like you can assert your parental authority from the beginning by telling them they don't get to summon you to come feed them in the middle of the night. You
Mhm.
can train them to sleep through the night from 8 weeks by asserting your authority.
Mhm.
And so from the beginning, a lot of these resources are telling parents, shut that part down.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of like the first step toward ordering your household correctly. So you don't have to look very far to see how that would become this kind of this absolute rejection of
Mhm.
empathy, because that is a threat to it's for parents, it's a threat. And if you believe these authors, if you believe what they're saying, you believe what they are teaching is biblical, then you are left having to decide, okay, if I want to be an obedient parent, if I want to be a good parent, I have to shut that part of myself down. This is often particularly gendered. These books, the primary readership for them is women, mothers. So you'll see very gendered language kind of used against mothers, like mothers especially will
Mhm.
have a hard time wanting to spank their children. So fathers, you need to step up and make sure you're helping with this and making sure that
Mhm.
you're keeping her in line and not letting her be too permissive or too empathetic. Um, and it's completely opposed to healthy connection. It
Yeah.
prevents parents from responding to the child in front of them. Instead, they rely on these scripts and these ideas and this ideology offered in these books. And you end up with this inability to just relate to the individual child and their individual needs. You're not supposed to
Mhm.
think about their individual needs and quirks first,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And it's just really destructive.
Yeah, it's destructive. It's so destructive in the moment and also long term, because this is what parents are practicing day in and day out if they're following it, which is why I think in many ways it directly sets families up for estrangement. Because then in adulthood, when the kind of illusion of compliance evaporates, um,
Mm. Yeah.
there's no skills. A lot of these resources, it's not just what they told parents to do, but what they left them bereft of, an understanding
Mm.
of child development or tools for connection. And in kind of uh, trying to think critically about that requires, exactly as you said, Matt, peeking behind the curtain to say, well, what do we mean by love? Because a lot
Yeah.
of verbal gymnastics are done to say, well, love is hurting the people who are dear to you. Doug Wilson says that directly. Love requires us to do that. A lot of like redefinitions of terms are happening to say, this may feel like punishment to you, but we're going to call it love. So when you do that at a certain point and you've said God's love is reflected primarily in this moment of cosmic punishment, then it becomes difficult for people to reevaluate because it feels like a complete faith deconstruction, which in some ways, deconstruction is a necessary element of thinking critically about these because everything's so wrapped up together. But that can leave people really, really stuck because they've been kind of catechized is the best word for it, maybe, to say, we will redefine these terms for you. And now these are the terms you operate by, and we will call it love. Whatever's going on here, we'll call it love.
I feel like we've kind of been at like the 30,000 foot, like, here's the book. Can I just like get real for our listeners, and you guys can speak and give me some wisdom, because I feel like I'm in it. Like these books and these authors that you have described were the people that my parents read, followed, and then when I had our firstborn, I was like, I guess I'd do the same thing. I don't know. And thankfully, I think we became foster parents, and our parenting had to change because of what the law was. Like, no spanking, no, like all of, and so all of a sudden got real of like, what do I believe? Why am I doing this? And so, but I think it's still in my bones. Like I act like my responses, hopefully, if my parents and my kids were on here, hopefully they would like be able to speak to this as they have watched different things happen. But there's been some changes, but I think it's still in me in some way. So let me give you a little example. And I think to what you're talking about, you can kind of give some wisdom. But just this week, it was my birthday. We were going out to dinner. My 13-year-old came home from cross-country practice running. And, as an 8th grader, I don't know. Do they just not like to wear deodorant? I'm not understanding like what is going on there. But he comes home after running. I'm like, oh my gosh, the whole house smells bad, And so I'm like, hey, buddy, you need to go take a shower. And he looked at me, and I said it just like that. Hey, buddy, you need to go take a shower. We're going out to eat. And he was like, I don't smell bad. And I was like, what? And he was like, it doesn't matter if I ran a couple miles. I don't smell bad. And I was like, hey, man, like, I'm getting that you don't want to take a shower, but like, just to be kind to the person, whoever you're sitting next to at the restaurant, would you please go take a shower? And he dug his heels in. Now, granted, he's a 13-year-old. He also was in foster care and adoption. There's a lot of stuff there. It's complicated. This isn't like maybe a typical, I don't know, maybe a typical 13-year-old would do the same thing, but he dug his heels in, and he was like, I'm not taking a shower. I don't smell bad, and I'm coming to dinner with you. I mean, like, it was just like, oh my gosh. Like, and out of my mouth came, this is just true serum, you're going to go take a shower and change your clothes, or you're not going to come with us. And he then got even more angry. Well, it didn't work. Just so you know, listener, it didn't work. Like he got in the car stinky, and I was like, I'm failing as a parent. I didn't parent him. He in the midst of it lied to me about. He then said I did take a shower. He didn't take a shower. Shower wasn't wet. Like all of this stuff. And I was like, I said to him when we got to the restaurant, hey, we're gonna need to talk about this, because there's a lot of that has happened. We're not going to do it right now because I don't think either one of us are in a place to do that, but we are going to have a conversation. So 24 hours goes by. I'm talking to a friend of mine with my son there, and he kind of tells her what happened. And out of her mouth said, sounds like mom really cared about a shower. Sounds like you really didn't care about a shower. What did you want? What were you longing for in not taking a shower? And he said, I just wanted to be with my mom. And I was like, oh my gosh. Now, I'm not excusing like him lying and him getting angry and telling me what to do and all of that stuff. Like, I'm not excusing that. But I didn't, as a parent, get to the heart of what he actually needed and wanted. And he didn't articulate in a way that I was understanding. Like, if he would have said, Mom, I just want to spend time with you, right? Like, but as a 13-year-old, they're learning how to do all of that. And what I see in your book, like the old way of doing it is get in the shower, like, and like you're grounded for life. And like, I'm the authority and I'm the ruler and you're just the kid, right? And what I'm seeing you present to us is there's another way of parenting that incorporates grace and truth in a way that we can love our kid. Now, I don't want my kid to like think that it's okay to lie and manipulate and do all of this stuff. I want to teach him how to ask for what he needs, right?
Mhm.
And if I can give it to him, I want to. And if I can't, I want to figure out a way to be able to communicate that. I mean, in my silly example, is that a fair like assessment of what your heart behind this is?
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, like, as you're describing that story, I think the thing that these books fail to do for so many parents who are in situations like that is adequately grapple with, you do not control your children. Like,
Mhm.
you parenting is being in a relationship with someone you don't control. One of the myths is that you can, right? Like,
Right.
Mm.
you can basically program your children to obey you from birth.
Mhm.
When the reality is, you can't. Now, I don't have teenagers, but I have little kids right now. And very early on, I can't make my child stop yelling. Like, I don't control the volume of their voice. I can try to coerce them. I
Mhm.
can try to very forcefully. Then it becomes a question of how forceful are you willing to be. But
Mm.
the like, how do I parent a person who has their own autonomy, free will,
Yep.
who is a person, a human person, who I don't get to harm in order to get them to do what I want to do? How do I be in relationship with that person when I'm
Mhm.
responsible for them, when I'm responsible to teach them and help them grow up to be healthy adults? That's a way harder question than
Mhm.
what does the Bible tell me to do, right? Like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
it's just a harder question, and it's one that does not have an easily packageable answer.
Yeah.
And that's the failure of this. So it's selling something
Yeah.
that literally does not exist. This perfect answer, this one size fits
Mhm.
all answer. And in that exchange with a teenager, it's like the uncomfortable reality is like, there might be an impasse. And in that moment, you can either catastrophize and say, "Oh, this is an affront to my parental authority. I must reestablish parental authority." You can
Mhm.
step into that adversarial relationship, or you can do like what you might do in a friendship and just take on the really hard, uncomfortable work of problem solving cooperatively and and not treating it as a I must win, because
Mhm.
who is
Yeah.
it, Marissa, that said, like, Doug Wilson, is that
A
you have to
lot of
win
them
every
say
time.
you
You
have
have
to
to
win,
win
but
every
yeah,
time,
Doug Wilson's big on that. Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, this idea that you have to win. And I think that really is such a powerful example. We there are a lot of these resources are written for parents of young children. So there are a lot of
Yes.
examples for young ones, but I like that you chose the example of a teen because the it, every season these sort of things happen. Parents would like to believe that once the tantrum stage is over, then it's over or something. But no, in every season, because you have another human being who has a will and
Mhm.
personhood and full autonomy. And so, yeah, there is this impossible to achieve expectation that's presented to parents, sets them up for failure.
Mhm.
And we hear from a number of people actually who training for foster care adoption was their gateway out because they couldn't use these resources. They were finally given an alternative,
Right.
because a lot of these resources, that this is the only way and there's no alternative. And
Mhm.
I think it ends up being so incredibly dangerous often, because all these resources offer is corporal punishment.
Yeah.
And when parents really are catastrophizing or are believing like, oh, the pressure's on me to get this right, it will escalate. And we heard from people who were spanked well through their teenage years because that's all their parents knew to do. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes I think these teachings did draw abusive people, but I think probably more often the case, you have devout parents who have
Yeah.
no idea what else to do and are told they need to do this, and probably have never explored their own family of origin scenarios that drew them to this teaching in the first place, and are kind of replicating some generational things. But it's heartbreaking because all of these things have very real consequences and rob families. It makes me think of that verse about
Mhm.
steal, kill, and destroy. It robs families of these
Yeah.
opportunities to connection,
Yeah.
like you've described here, like these moments that could be points to see and listen to an individual, to love our neighbor,
Mhm.
even the smallest and newest neighbors in our lives, to practice all the one anothering principles that we do have, biblical principles about compassion, forbearance, patience, loving the one who's restoring the one who sins gently, any number of things that these hard parenting moments, if we would allow them, could be formative for us as parents as well. Could invite us to Christian maturity in new and fresh ways, because all of us, children and adults alike, are on this path that as Christians we believe God designed human beings to develop from immaturity to maturity. So these ideas that both children and parents would somehow achieve perfection early on, these sort of like in a number of ways, are just out of touch, biblically speaking, out of touch, developmentally speaking, and leave people in sad places. And I think it's a difficult reckoning. We hear from parents reflecting back to have intended good and believed that this is what God wanted, and then to have this kind of horrific discovery that, oh no, maybe that caused harm, to hear their adult children naming things like religious trauma or how they experience these things. And that takes a lot of courage and humility to look at. It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could speak to that just a little bit more, because some of I'm all my kids are in their 20s. I was raised by, I think, well-meaning parents who employed these things. My wife and I were well-meaning parents who employed a lot of these things as well. But now our kids are older. And so I wonder if you can speak to perhaps listeners who are in a similar spot where their kids, they don't have the opportunity to sort of shape, a new kind of parenting when their kids are little. So maybe like listeners who maybe feel wounded by the discipline they experienced growing up, or parents who have a sense of regret about the ways that they engaged with their own children. Any advice just on how to face that? Like you said, it takes courage and humility. But what can we do?
Yeah, it's so hard.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I would speak to the parents who feel a lot of regret and even shame over it. We did hear from a number of parents. I would say when we really try in our book not to heap shame on people who are actively using or have used these resources. They have agency and made choices, but also if you were in a community where these were the resources given to you and given to you with fervor and a sense of certainty, and you looked around you and it was all you saw, especially if it was coupled with like political and culture war agendas as well. I mean, it is powerful. Community is formative. And that's not to give a pass, but it is to give grace, and it is to give that. We just don't want to add to the shame of that. I did hear from a number of people who have said that one of the hardest things is if they have a parent who is unwilling to consider that these resources were harmful, because they are still attached so tightly to this idea of biblical inerrancy and the way that this term biblical is used to market these resources. They can't bring themselves to consider that these ideas are actually more rooted in just the personal opinions and experiences of the people writing them. They aren't these timeless truths. So I think speaking to parents who are wherever they are and the kind of re-examining, what did we do? My children are telling me this was harmful. I think it is really hard and it's really painful, but I think being open to that consideration and not hearing it as an attack on your faith, not hearing it as an attack, but as an attack on the way that faith and the Bible have been mobilized and in some cases weaponized to market something, to sell something. The economic incentives here are not good when it comes to these kinds of resources in Christian publishing. I think maybe in some ways it's better now, I'm not sure, but especially at the time, the incentives were not good. And everybody suffered for that. Marissa, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say for parents kind of struggling with that moment, I would say there's grace for parents too. If you have this moment of reckoning. What's waiting for you on the other side isn't a cosmic spanking because you screwed up, you know, like in this mindset. The consequences are there, right? Like one of the lies and myths of one size fits all parenting is this idea that, oh, well, here's the next formula for how to get this right. And that isn't true. Like what it requires is the difficult work of reflection, of anger, of grief, of looking back and saying, what drew me to these teachings? Why did they seem right to me at the time? Or why was I unable to let them go? Of learning new tools that you probably weren't given, of how to listen to the child in front of you, whatever their age, of how to tolerate difference in them or a different opinion in them, and how to respectfully engage with their boundaries. And there are consequences. We can't obviously say whether that can lead to restored relationship, but I think it's the first necessary step. We have heard from some families who were able to navigate that and say, yes, that was fruitful and we found a new path forward. Others found a different result, and that is just a heartbreaking reckoning, because that in many families this led to abuse. This enabled abuse, frankly. And we tried to really take these resources in good faith and think, if someone applied these consistently, what kind of fruit would that bear? And so for those adult children, I would say I'm so very sorry, because that's such a profound betrayal to have been mistreated and abused in the name of God, and for that to have been enabled by Christian community. And I think it's very important that Christians, I'm a Christian, I think we're all Christians here, say we participated in that by the way we've platformed and sold and circulated these resources. And that is the stuff of millstones and the stuff of stumbling blocks and the stuff of shipwrecked faith. And I think it's a very difficult thing to navigate. I hear from a lot of adult children who understandably have walked away from the faith entirely, who have panic attacks when they go to church because these ideas were so wrapped up with the Bible, who cannot relate to their parents. It's too painful. And then everything in between. So I would also just want to validate, because I think sometimes it helps to hear, if parents applied some of these resources faithfully, you endured unspeakable things. And I think it's important to validate that, because too often the church family system and Christians dismiss that and kind of shuffle the blame back on the people who are naming injury. And it's that same old messaging, like, cheerfully obey, stop whining. Like, we don't want to hear from the children, especially not in that tone. And that's inappropriate here. There's a lot to grieve and lament and be angry about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just as a word of encouragement, I think your book does that well.
Thanks.
I think your book functions to see people who either know they're harmed and no one else will tell the truth about it, or feel conflicted that they resent maybe a godly way of being raised. You mentioned people who walk away from God because they conflate the theology of their childhood with the triune God of love. And so your book does function, I think, as validation, as an attuning witness to the harm that people have incurred, but also as permission for those of us who don't want to pass on that harm to others, that we don't have to. And so I just appreciate the work that you've done. The book, again, is called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. Kelsey and Marissa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.